Welcome to Bit Stories, the show about really awesome software and the stories behind it. I'm Josh Bancroft with Intel Software Network. If you're listening to this from an RSS reader, a podcast subscription, or a streaming player, you can find our website at intel.com/software/bitstories. The show you're about to hear was recorded at OSCON 2007, the O'Reilly Open Source Conference. Cory Doctorow gave a speech entitled "Privacy is Not Dead, Let's Not Kill It," about the choices we have in making software that we control rather than software that controls us. This session is about 30 minutes long and includes Cory's speech as well as some great question and answer discussion at the end. We'll start off with an introduction by Tim O'Reilly, the host of the executive briefing, and then Cory Doctorow.
I recently read Cory Doctorow's book, Little Brother. Is that out yet? Next May. Anyway, it's a fabulous book, and it reminded me in a wonderful way of sort of a Victorian reformer who wrote books about the British Navy. And I read a book called Masterman Ready. And it was basically about people being shipwrecked. And it was kind of like this very instructional novel, which was sort of like a practical guide of moral and practical education on what you should do if you're shipwrecked. And as I read Little Brother, I thought, this is a sort of a wonderful guide, very tutorial. I thought everybody should read this, for how you might act if you were living in a surveillance society. It was sort of like, wow, I couldn't give somebody a better manual. We couldn't write, if we were saying, let's write a how-to book, because it was through the mechanism of the story. You told us, how we would evade surveillance, how we would combat, various, and it's just a sort of fabulous idea. And I thought maybe you could just talk to us about some of those ideas, because it seems to me that the future we're heading towards is one that is very different from the one we grew up in terms of the mechanisms by which we are being observed, and then we have to think about how we can protect ourselves.
Sure. So, I wrote this novel, Little Brother, and it's a book about hacker kids who declare war on the Department of Homeland Security. It's the kind of thing you want to give to your young teens to be reading now. And every chapter has an instructable style how-to for building technology to get metal onto an airplane or clone someone's RFIDs.
I was going to lead you to your...
sure.
Because you're actually getting...
I'll just give a little talk.
Yeah, so I can just leave you to...
You can leave me to... Wind me up and let me go.
Anyway,
whenever this email...
When the book comes out, read it, give it to your kids.
So, at the center of that book is a hypothesis, and that's the hypothesis that technology isn't neutral, that we make decisions about technology that determines what effect it has on our lives. So technology could be a force for putting us in more control of our lives and giving us more freedom. Or it could be a force for giving us less control of our lives and making it easier for people to take away our freedoms. And it really, at the end of the day, is up to us as a society, and then very specifically, us in this room. We secret Morlocks of the universe who keep all the machines running under the ground, the heroes of the information age who are designing the systems that will or won't make us more free. So one of the things that technology absolutely lets us do is control things, control our lives, control other people's lives. And as a society and as a species, we have a certain affinity for control. Now, there's a reason that we have an affinity for control, and that's because it makes us feel like the universe is at our fingertips. Sometimes we can go too far. Mark Twain, one of the great heroes of literature and a great thinker, Mark Twain believed that at the moment of creation, the universe was like a billiard table, and that God, to the extent that there was a God, was the cue ball that scattered the triangle and sent them all in motion. And if we knew the position of each of those balls in the triangle, and we knew the English and the force applied to the cue ball, that we would know everything that unrolled in the universe thereafter. He was a determinist and a kind of fatalist. It tells you a little bit about his books when you realize that he didn't actually believe in free will. Now, this is kind of a silly idea on its face, but it's rooted in something very important. It's rooted in the idea of empirical measurement. It's rooted in the idea of using technology, the most fundamental technologies we have, the cognitive prosthesis that is pen and paper, to write down what happens in the world so that we can check our observations against it and refine the way that we live on the basis of how the world behaves against us, on the idea of measuring objective reality. And writing down stuff works. We have a biological imperative to finding causal relationships in the world around us. At some point, we all shared ancestors who observed that the antelopes came to the watering hole at certain times of day and enriched themselves by killing the antelopes when they got there. And those people were more fecund, and so we are all of us necessarily descended from people who were able to establish causal relationships. And so we look for them the way that we also look for faces in the clouds. It's hardwired in us to see causality. And this causality gave rise to all that we, this penchant for causality gave rise to all that we know about the world. The bankruptcy trustee who's going to tell you to write down everything that you spend in a little book, because trying to remember how much you spend on coffee is actually not a very good way to find out how much you're spending on coffee. You're either going to wildly overestimate or wildly underestimate what you're spending on coffee. If you go to a nutritionist and you say, I want to lose a couple of pounds, the first thing she'll do is tell you to write down what you eat in a little book. Even if you're depressed, if you're having problems with your life and your work and your loved ones, and you see a therapist, that therapist might tell you to write down when your moods arise and what circumstances give rise to it, something called cognitive therapy. And this empirical way of measuring how we feel is itself a powerful tool for understanding the world. Why, some decades ago, the entire Industrial Revolution took place largely as a consequence of people like Taylor and Galbraith, who went and wrote down how workers worked. They would measure every movement that you took, create time motion studies, create new efficiencies in the workplace, and dictate to workers how to do their jobs such that they could realize orders of magnitude gains in productivity that we never had before. But there is an important difference between Taylorism, the time motion study, and cognitive therapy, or Weight Watchers logbooks, or your bankruptcy book. And the difference is whether or not your behavior is being measured so that you can improve yourself, or whether your behavior is being measured so that someone else can tell you how to behave in the future. And that's an enormous difference, and it's the difference between whether or not technology is our master or our servant. So individuals can only do so much in this world. In order to get really big things done, to build jet airplanes, cities, subways, even to famously to raise a child, we need a village. We need collective action. And collective action requires some form of control. And that's the other reason that we as a species trend to control, is that we have a built-in need to control things, because we are, after all, the people who managed to survive to populate the world in our teeming billions, something that we couldn't do without big, orderly social systems that included mechanisms of control. But the internet makes it possible to collaborate together in ways that we never thought possible, with less control than we ever conceived of. Right? It used to be that to convene a group of technical people to discuss a technical subject, you needed, first of all, to go around the world and canvass them, figure out who they were, get them all to come to a hotel like this one, give some of them lavalier mics, and put them on stages and have them talk. And then someone invented Usenet. And all of a sudden, it was possible to convene 1 million technological conversations without any need for doing this business beforehand of getting a whole bunch of people in a room together. And not only did we invent Usenet, but shortly thereafter, a guy named John Gilmore invented the alt hierarchy. And it turned out that you not only didn't need to get everyone into a room together, you didn't even need to get everyone to agree on what the subjects would be, because very quickly the alt hierarchy grew to a scale larger than the entire Usenet that preceded it. And Usenet was just the beginning. Look at blogs, look at Flickr, right? So Flickr, every day, by watching the decay tag on Flickr, a group of people who've never met each other, never conspired together, don't really know each other exist, compose a coffee table photo book on the theme of decay. That's my favorite Flickr tag. And some days it seems to trend towards science projects in the back of someone's workplace refrigerator, and some days it's all rust, and some days it's hummus and glorious colors from some autumnal forest floor, and some days it's combinations of all of this. These people are conspiring together without meeting. Their collective effort is an emergent property of technology that takes the place of control. Why? Technology can do this in ways that even go beyond tagging. So look at Google. which turns all of us into conspirators to know the structure of the internet. Every one of us who've ever written the web, who's ever made a link between two pages, has contributed a link that Google can count, and so find out what the structure of the internet is, what the underlying structure of the internet, which pages are about what, which ones are important, and to whom. And then, of course, there's free and open source software. And I don't have to tell you, except to mention that the idea of volunteers coming together and emerging an operating system the way that ants emerge an anthill is as weird as millions of people turning up with random bits of scrap metal and getting a skyscraper out of it. And yet it happens every day. This computer in front of me is running an operating system built in much that way, with systems of control that varied from large and monolithic to small and scattered, and all of them pieced together without needing any of those big authoritarian structures. And we, at the same time as we are bent to control, are bent to subverting it. It's built into us. My editor at Information Week, Mitch Wagner, who some of you may know, one day found on one of his blog posts, a blog post about, Oracle versus MySQL, a couple of 9-year-old girls gossiping about some other girls in their classroom. And he logged onto his message board and said, "Excuse me, girls, I don't mean to interrupt, but Crystal may be a skag, but I don't know what that has to do with MySQL versus Oracle." And they said, "Oh, it has nothing to do with it." But of course, our school blocks access to IM and to MySpace and so on. So we've just found a way of doing it. In fact, the internet is a tremendous tool for subverting control and for allowing us to indulge our penchant for subverting control. That's right in the PC and the internet's DNA. For just as once upon a time, the only screens you could see in your workplace were those that some priesthood of the mainframe had determined that you were allowed to see, and then people risked their jobs by bringing Apple II Pluses into their workplace, hiding them under their desk and running Lotus 1-2-3 on them so that they could see the screens that they thought they should be able to see, and so realize incredible new efficiencies for their workplace and revolutionize the world. Today, we have people who are risking termination by smuggling in peer-to-peer protocols that subvert their workplace firewall, because the same priesthood has determined what size attachment they can send, to whom, which documents can and can't leave the firewall, what protocols can and can't run, which keywords can be displayed on web pages. They're going out there and contracting with companies that devise huge lists of keywords or huge lists of web pages that are too naughty for the workplace or just right for the workplace. The idea is that you can hire an entire boiler room full of bored Midwestern semi-employables and turn them loose on the internet, and they will accurately catalog every web page on the internet into naughty or nice, and this works about as well as you might expect. The fact is that control has its limits. When you watch everyone, you watch no one. Tim and I once stayed in a hotel in Finland at a conference called the Torni. The Torni is Helsinki's tallest building, central Helsinki's tallest building. And during the Soviet occupation, the KGB took it over, and they used it for their headquarters, this 12-story building. And when the KGB left, the Finns renovated it and found 40 kilometers of wiretap wire in the walls. Because control at that level is corrosive. And as soon as you start watching people, the people you want to watch most of all are the people who are supposedly on your side. The Stasi had files on every citizen in East Germany, and they knew who was telling unpatriotic jokes, and they knew who was having affairs and who could be blackmailed because they were gay, but they missed the fact that the wall was about to come down. Because when you start watching everyone, you watch no one. When you make the haystack bigger, it doesn't make the needles easier to find. So we have with computers not only erected systems to subvert control, but we have also erected systems to increase control, and some of those are legal. For example, is there anyone in this room who doesn't consider themselves to be a copyright criminal? Well, me neither. It's impossible not to be a copyright criminal. Now, we might say, well, of course, they're not going to sue me for infringing copyright, and you're right, they probably won't. But what if there's something that you're doing that someone doesn't like that isn't illegal? Wouldn't it be convenient if there was something that you were doing that was illegal that they could come and bust you for? Well, in fact, there is file sharing, and there's a kid at Swarthmore who maintained a piece of software called Flatland. It scraped all the SMB shares on the school network and indexed them the way that Google scrapes all the HTTP shares on the public internet and indexes them. And they went after him, and they busted him, and they hit him up for his life savings. Now, why did they bust him? They busted him for writing a search engine? Of course not. Writing a search engine is not illegal. They busted him for sharing files. And how did they know he was sharing files? Well, he was an American college kid. Right? American college kids are all sharing files. Now, as part of the settlement, the recording industry asked him to change majors because they don't want people writing software who think that writing search engines that scrape this campus network are a good idea. They wanted to set an example for geeks around the world. Now, EFF and others humiliated them out of this. They made enough of a stink. But that's the corrosive effect on society of ubiquitous control. At the end of the day, we need to sharply and clearly distinguish between empiricism, what do I do, when do I do it, the ability to know ourselves, like it says on the wall of the Great Temple, and totalitarianism, knowing what you do, knowing when you do it, knowing who you think you are. And the ability of machines to add us up and to be totalitarian is greater than it's ever been before. And we as technologists swallow silly lies about what it can and can't do. We say, oh, well, we've got an RFID, but it's only readable at 2 inches. Unless you go to the Black Hat conference where they're reading them at 50 feet. And the RFID only has a number in it. It's not associated with my name. Unless you get picked up later and then someone says, well, your RFID has been in the following 50,000 places. Can you account for all of them? Is there one of them that possibly coincides with something you've done that's naughty? And we say, well, yeah, continuous nonstop identification is just like the identification we had before, but more so. Well, the identification we had before was occasional and generally based on particularized suspicion. And today the identification we have is ubiquitous and universal and continuous. So most recently I was in Disney World last Christmas, and we found that not only is your bag searched on the way into every ride, but that they also fingerprint you on the way into every park. They say it's not a fingerprinting, they say they're measuring the unique characteristics of your fingertip. And we found that as we went through one day, the 9-year-old behind us in the line, he had already unzipped all the pockets of his backpack to have them searched because he knew that as a good resident of Disney World, it was his job to have his bag searched. And when we got to the turnstiles, we said, well, we understand we can show ID instead of being fingerprinted. And they said, well, no, we can't. Let me go talk to my supervisor. And the kid behind us piped up and he said, why, you must be fingerprinted. Everyone must be fingerprinted. That is the way it works here in Disney World. And I think we used to worry, rightly, that Disney might turn our little girls into princesses or they might turn our kids into consumers. Now I think we need to worry that Disney is turning our kids into willing citizens of a police state. We are redesigning the general purpose computer such that it goes from being something that does anything that its owner asks of it into something that does some things that its owner asks of it and some things that other people ask of it that its owner doesn't want to do. And we're doing that through digital rights management, information rights management, and related technologies. These are technologies that treat the owner of the computer as an attacker and seek to find ways to subvert the owner's will by having private spaces within memory that the user isn't allowed to look in, by having private processes that the user is not allowed to control. And this is a fundamentally bad idea. We don't need to do it this way. We don't need to sleepwalk into the surveillance state. It doesn't make us safer. Our right to be secure and safe is not abrogated by technology, and technology can serve or enslave, and that's our choice. This is about myware or spyware. Does our technology enable users to know themselves better, or does it enable someone to watch them better? Kids have a remarkable resilience to control and a pranking spirit. Think of Mitch's message boards. Think of the kids who are running around now with RFID cloners. We had a great presentation this year at eTech of a kid who's built an RFID cloner. Get within a few feet of you and she can clone all of your RFIDs, broadcast them herself, and interdict them. Think of kids who are spreading information on the internet about how to subvert the checkers at various points to overwhelm them with false positives. In a shoot first, ask questions later world, the possibilities of doing this for our kids are endless. And that's what this book that Tim was talking about is all about. And that's what it's hoping to encourage. To encourage a world where kids use the technology that we provide them with to question control instead of enabling it. And I hope that you, as people who are key to the free software revolution, will be part of that as well, because ultimately that's what free software is about. It's about controlling your computer instead of your computer controlling you. Thank you.
You want to take questions, Cory?
I can, but I've got a red flashing light here. So.
Okay, so...
So the question is, what about McLuhan? McLuhan says the medium is the message. And what about Ortega y Gasset talking about technologically competent barbarians? So how does that fit into your conversation about what we're doing here?
So I think technology does embed ideologies. So I think that, for example, if you design a technology that takes your user's behavior data and uploads it to the internet,
right,
and then sequesters it and sells it off and gives it to other people, that technology has a message for its user, and that user is an ambulatory wallet, right? Shut up and take it.
Right.
If you, on the other hand, design a piece of technology that watches what your user does on her own computer and lets her serve herself better, and then enables her to collaborate with her peers, so that she's not a business model or a sticky eyeball, then that sends a different message. That sends the message that the expectation you should have of your computer is that it is not a snitch, but a competent and impartial butler.
Okay.
I love the fact that my computer auto-completes the email addresses if I've sent them once. I wouldn't like the fact that it sent them to someone else.
Yeah.
Does that make
Good.
sense?
Okay. Now, what about security at the airport? I mean, that's your classic sort of, bend over and take it.
That's a wonderful example of technology that's sending the wrong message to us. It's sending the message that the important thing to do if you want to be secure is to behave as though you're afraid, and to take any step that reassures your fear instead of taking those steps that address a threat that you've identified and that can be shown to address that threat. So, I think that for so long as we only engage in security measures that defend us from attacks that have failed and probably will fail, like hypothetical moisture bombs or shoe bombs, that we don't actually make ourselves safer. I mean, obviously, if either of those attacks had succeeded, we wouldn't know that they existed. Right? The only reason we're defending against those attacks is because they didn't work.
Right.
And so, I think that it's up to every one of us, to every time we go through there, to not smile and accept it, and to do whatever we can to let people know around us that we don't consider this to be a fair deal, and that when it comes time to really do the right thing, which is voting, that we vote for candidates and we hold candidates to the fire on this stuff.
Yeah, but then then you miss your plane.
Yeah. Those who would trade liberty for a little bit of transport deserve neither liberty nor transport.
Fair enough. Very good.
I have great faith and hope in the ability of youth to subvert, just as part of their nature. At the same time, I'm kind of shocked at the kids these days, sounding like my dad, being so willing to give up so much personal and information that I would consider incredibly private. You read about college and high school MySpace or blog postings coming to haunt you at job application time and things like that, but the potential is far worse. So where's the sweet spot there too? Where at what point does the willing enthusiasm of people to participate and connect become a real potential danger, and more importantly too, how do you inform people about that? How do you get the message you're giving us today out to all the kids going on to MySpace?
Bruce Sterling once wrote that the only way we were going to get people to care about their carbon footprints would be to design awesome designer sunglasses that were the coolest sunglasses in the world that showed you CO2. Right, so that in order to look cool, you had to inhabit a world in which all the CO2 was visible. I think that's a very insightful point of Bruce's. I think that we can, for example, imagine a widget that is a privacy widget that counts how often you disclose your personal information. And in fact, Justin Hall is working on something very much like this. He's doing something called passively multiplayer online gaming, or PMOG. And what PMOG does is it assigns you points. It's a piece of malware, runs on your own computer, and assigns you points for running missions on the internet. And those missions are reading your email, looking at the web, going to Wikipedia, getting extra points for going behind Wikipedia and looking at a discuss page, major bonus points for installing Firefox, even more for uninstalling Internet Explorer, and so on. The idea being to key the incredibly compelling experience of gaming, which, as we see with the reCAPTCHA and the Google Memory game or Google ESP game and all of those, that's an incredibly powerful motivating force to tie that into media literacy. And actually, my fiance commissioned Justin's work for the BBC as a public service thing, because what the BBC figured they could do is they could create a set of objectives that reflected good media literacy on the internet. And that then they could turn that loose on the British public as a game, run leaderboards, interview leading scorers, come up with missions, group missions that you have to get together with your friends to run in order to really succeed. And if you go to bud.com, you can find Justin's stuff. And he's developing it in a really open way. And I think that we could imagine a great mission that would be all about counting the amount of times that you yield your privacy over the internet. I think that'd be very tight.
Many of the points you made are very, very important. I'd like to return to one for a second. And that is, when you were making the distinction about the nature of identity, currently how it's changing from something that is sporadic and under certain circumstances to something that is ubiquitous, continuous, and with modern storage, persistent. Very, very fundamental changes. And there's an irony that's going on in the tech right this second that I'm just kind of aware of. And that is that with the coalescing with OpenID and the single sign-on movements and Liberty and some of these other things, that certain commercial forces that have been waiting in the background see the coalescing of the single sign-on identity as an opportunity to come in with mountainous Army River, Colorado River-like force to change the rules of the game and use that identity to create a playing structure where there will be billing associated with that identity.
Yeah.
And it also it dovetails perfectly in with the security extremists.
Yeah, so I call that the urinary tract infection business model, where all the uses that you used to get on the internet that used to come in a free gush now come in a painful dribble. Every time you want to click your mouse, it's an extra penny. And I think that this starts with the DRM people, but it's all over the place. And it stems from a science fiction story that we used to tell each other in the 80s, and that was the story of the Internet of a Million Billings, right? And it was, I think it's a bellhead thing. I think it comes from the telcos, where that was their bread and butter, was finding ways to nickel and dime you to death. You hear even today stories about someone's grandmother dying and them going in and pulling out her phone bills and finding out that she's been renting that Princess phone since 1957 and has paid $25,000 for it to the local bell. And that, I think, is a pretty common story. And I think that one of the things that free software does is it resists that narrative. It resists the narrative that every time you click your mouse, it costs you something. I think that's a very powerful force. Now, you're right that the more identified we are and the easier it is to identify ourselves and the extent to which we call that identification safe because, you're using OpenID and you're making a minimal disclosure and you've got a NIM that you're handing out to that website and not your real identity and it can't track back to you, you do set up a world where billings are much simpler. But keep in mind that we've had telescopes for centuries, and there's still a social stigma attached to pointing them through our neighbors' windows. And I think that we as technologists can establish norms that set out whether or not it becomes ubiquitous to bill as well as identify. And I think that those norms are a powerful factor on the internet. Like, how do you know the internet was designed by engineers and not lawyers? Well, because engineers are essentially part of the academic tradition. We do things by the scientific method. And, the scientific method is that I give you a paper, you look at it, you mark it up, you give it back to me. And that's why when you hit Control-R in your mailer, in your newsgroup reader, or today in MySpace or whatever messaging platform you're using, the first thing it does is import the entire body of the message that you're replying to into that message. Now, no lawyer would design an internet where every act of communication started with a copyright infringement. The norm that we set out as engineers, as technologists, as geeks designing the internet has changed the world, right? The whole world is more internet-like now. Every profession, if you're a lawyer or a travel agent, if you use email in the office, when you get an email, the first thing you do is mark it up the way an engineering professor would, because that's what the internet came from. And we're in a position to establish those norms for the next century. And we have to ask ourselves, do we want a ubiquitous surveillance norm, or do we want a norm of ubiquitous anonymity? Do we want to strengthen the anonymity of the internet by building more technologies like Tor and running Tor nodes, or do we want to reduce it by adding an identity layer to every service we run? And I think that that's the question we can answer. Right? We're in the position to answer it.
So if you want anonymity, then you get spam, because that's an anonymous way to send junk.
So, well, we eliminated all the open relays. Do you have less spam? It's just harder to send legitimate email, right? It's like well, we've eliminated everyone's shoes at the checkpoints. Now we're bomb-free. Well, we're not, right?
Well, but now, I mean, I get 10 times more spam than I get real email.
Yeah, but we've shut down the biggest tool of anonymity for mail, which was open relays. So it's harder to be a legitimate anonymous person. Did that solve spam? No. And every complex system has parasites. The only way we're going to get rid of spam is by eliminating the complexity of the internet. AOL didn't have spam because when an AOL customer spammed another AOL customer, they knew who they were and they could terminate them. Well, I think that's it. Thank you all very much.
What you just heard was Cory Doctorow's speech, "Privacy is not dead, let's not kill it," given at the O'Reilly Radar Executive Briefing at OSCON 2007. Thanks for listening to BitStories. You can find us on the web at intel.com/software/bitstories. Let us know what you think of the show. Post a comment, or you can contact me, Josh Bancroft, at jabancroft@gmail.com. If you're a user or developer and would like to be on BitStories, contact me, Josh Bancroft, and let me know what your story is. I'd love to have you on the show. Thanks again for listening.